I'm happy to be here with you and to celebrate this rewriting of the history of philosophy together with Sarah Hutton. Our knowledge of the history of philosophy is always partial. Each generation only partially knows its own tradition, because each sees the history of philosophy as framed by contemporary categories, philosophical as well as cultural. The history of philosophy as a whole is thus a record of inclusions and exclusions, of forgettings and rediscovering. The philosophy of the present is not the book on the top of the pile, containing all the information in the books below. Rather, the pile of books discloses multiple worlds of ideas which we can explore to discover insights alternative to those currently popular, some of which we may never have heard of. Such a wealth of new insights is offered by the study of the history of women philosophers, where, however, the criteria for inclusion and exclusion differ from the applied and the mainstream. The record of the work of women philosophers was not highly regarded, as their writings were excluded for reasons of cultural misogyny. Now, however, we have a major body of work informing us about women philosophers from antiquity up to the present. As the historical records prove, women have long been creating original contributions to philosophy. We have valuable writings from female philosophers from antiquity and the Middle Ages, and continuous tradition from the Renaissance to today. The history of women philosophers stretches back as far as the history of philosophy itself. The presence as well as the absence of women philosophers throughout the history and throughout the course of the history parallels the history of philosophy as a whole. Edith Stein, Hannah Arendt, and Simone de Beauvoir, the most famous representatives of this tradition in the 20th century, did not appear from nowhere. They stand, so to speak, on the shoulders of the female titans who came before them. Although women were restricted in their access to education and participation in society, these restrictions could not completely prevent them from thinking and writing. When we investigate the history of female philosophers, we do not merely exchange one canon for another, in which the same things are said and the same topics examined. Rather, the canon shaped by female philosophers has its own characteristics and traditions, and it can be read both as a history of resistance and critique, and as a tradition of advances and of original contributions. The material brought to light gives us cause for new reflections, to rethink both our concepts and interpretations of the history of philosophy in general and our view of the history of female philosophers in particular. First, some methodological reflections. Quote, "This world has always belonged to males," quote end, Beauvoir wrote in her Second Sex in 1949. She presented there an impressive number of names of women philosophers, including Aspasia, Marie de Gournay, Émilie de Châtelet, Mary Wollstonecraft, and many more, some of whom are now considered to form part of the canon of women philosophers. Beauvoir, however, dedicated no further studies to these authors, convinced that women were forced into absence and, whenever visible, mirrored the values of men. Similarly, 30 years after, the feminist historian Gerda Lerner, though herself she had access to an even larger amount of relevant material, including works of the female authors of the Middle Ages, repeated Beauvoir's comments in writing that, quote, current scholarship holds that women made no significant impact on the writing of history until the 18th century, quote end. Like Beauvoir, Lerner judged female work through a male lens, thereby reducing women's achievements to copies of, quote, the same pattern men had much earlier created, quote end. Lerner denied that earlier women had possessed the innovative potential to be philosophers because, quote, women were then already educationally disadvantaged and did not significantly participate in the creation of the culture's symbol system, quote end. Feminist research on the history of philosophy reflects this restrictive attitude. It is focusing on the history of misogyny, for instance in feminist studies on Plato and Hegel. Its interpretational strategy is also prominently in its bibliography of feminist philosophers writing about the history of philosophy, which is, it is in Stanford Encyclopedia, but it is shown in many, many books. It is divided into 35 subsections on male philosophers, alongside only 7 that refer to women in the history of philosophy. There is no doubt that feminist philosophy has created a new perspective for research on the history of philosophy. Yet such research seems to suffer from a paradox. How should we explain that women contributed to the history of philosophy, while at the same time asserting that they were excluded? How can our interpretational pattern be changed to accept the record of the rich history of women philosophers without denying the oppression under which they lived? One of the most important insights provided by the research of the last 30 years is that there always have been eras and institutions which enabled the participation of women. This revelation shows us that there were circumstances which allowed, or at least did not hinder or destroy, their work or even their lives, as it has been the case with Hypatia or Olympe de Gouges. My concern thus belongs to the history of women philosophers and stands in contrast with a contemporary, perhaps feminist concern that has directed many feminist philosophers. This contrast is reflected in what I call the two paradoxes of feminist history of women philosophers. The first is, how can there be women philosophers with their own philosophical standing when the interpretational claim allows them only to come to the fore as excluded and marginalized? And the second is, how can we, as feminist philosophers, claim that women did a gender-aware philosophy in a universal validity when we criticize at the same the male philosophers and a canon as being merely the expression of a specifically male concern, albeit its universal claim. This is the problem. Here I try to tackle these two paradoxes, the paradox of the inclusion of the excluded and the gendering of the universal, and I start to illustrate the first of the two paradoxes, giving some examples demonstrating the pattern of obliviousness and rediscovery of women philosophers throughout the history of philosophy. So, second, the inclusion of the excluded. Gilles Ménage, for all those who do not know that, he wrote in 1690, the compiler of the Historia Molierum Philosopharum, a now famous collection of sources indicating the existence of some 65 women philosophers in antiquity, observed the same pattern of obliviousness to female authors. He notes that, given this large number, it is astonishing that single members of the group were still seen as exceptions to the rule that women do not write philosophy, as it is the case with Theano and Themistocles, both remembered only as singular phenomena by Didymus and Lactantius. Aspasia and Diotima, the distinguished teachers of Socrates, and the very start of the history of philosophy, have established an enormous role throughout European cultural history, although they are presumably the most critically and controversially discussed women philosophers in both mainstream and feminist historical research. The Renaissance epoch especially contains a surprisingly large number of references to female figures from antiquity, often linked to the Platonic context. Hypatia, the head of the Alexandrian Platonic Academy, was highly appreciated during the Renaissance, and Raphael is said to have pictured himself as Hypatia in his famous fresco, The School of Athens, where she is the only female representative. We find female leaders in the academic context in the revived Platonic academies of later centuries, and aristocratic women of the French court who were connected to the Medici family and thus to this Platonic tradition, and they are said to have boldly advanced the status of women, as in the case of Louise de Savoy and Margaret of Navarre, both the patrimons, the one of Agrippa of Nettesheim, the other of Marie de Gonnet. We observe in this time the criticism against Aristotle, connecting the falsities of his cosmology with his misogynist theories. These references live on, for example, in Lucrezia Marinella's essay of 1591 on the nobility and excellence of women, which refers explicitly to Aspasia and Diotima and reclaims hereby the superiority of women. The standard history retelling the narrative of the single and exceptional woman tends, like a veil, to conceal the tradition of women's ideas. On the other side, oft-repeated claims of modesty, or missing education, humility, do also not withstand a more detailed investigation. Margaret King, for example, provides, albeit she provides, important material drawn from the period here addressed. She does not argue in favor of the achievements of the female philosophers of the Renaissance period. I quote her. "The learned women of the Renaissance," she says, "received no degrees and exerted no great influence on emerging trends in the history of ideas." Quote end. According to the interpretation proposed here, a second look uncovers, however, a history of educational institutions which impacts our topic in interesting ways. Humility claims and self-assurance do not contradict each other, as we shall see in various examples and as we expect from every intelligent person, I would say, but rather form a combination that is conducive to productive reasoning. Margaret Cavendish is aware, for example, of having not great proficiency in Latin and French. However, combating those, quote, "whose heads are filled with tropes and conceits," quote end. So she combats them with words that flow, quote, "easily and freely." So she uses this position against those, and her modesty is to be understood quite differently as it has been. To judge women's writings using lower standards stigmatizes those outstanding women who did not fit the pattern. Even du Châtelet, from whom we know that she was fluent in 7 languages, as well as in mathematics and physics, she presents herself as a woman of deficient education, having been, and these are the quotes that are always taken to describe her, having been interested, I quote, "in the care of hair and teeth," quote end. But in a letter to the King of Prussia, she insists confidentially and with self-assurance, and in no contradiction to the former quote, "There may be metaphysicians and philosophers whose knowledge is greater than mine. I haven't met them." Quote end. A deeper look into the history of educational institutions presents not only exceptions that further impact the topic of concern. An example is also the University of Bologna, which, because it emerged from secular schools of medicine and jurisprudence, contrasted the Catholic foundations of Cologne, Oxford and Paris. There is evidence that women philosophers taught in Bologna. Betisa Gozzadini and Novella d'Andrea are named in the 13th century. Dorothea Bucca, professor in Bologna from 1390 on, gained such fame that scholars, we have the testimonies, scholars from throughout Europe came to hear her. Later, the Academy of Bologna was also one of the few European academies, at least partially, open to women. Agnesi, Bassi and du Châtelet became its members. Thus, while it is true that women suffered a history of subjection, there were circumstances in which the revolt against these restrictions was able to become productive. We observe that women were widely engaged in educational affairs already from the 16th century and even earlier on. And when we rewrite the history of philosophy, we will rewrite the history, also the history of education, and we will show that from the ancient authors on, up to Astel, Epinay, Macaulay, and even Hannah Arendt, we will provide an important stream on the history of philosophy and education. Undoubtedly, due to the own experience of subjection, women philosophers played this important role in the resistance, in giving the intellectual disputes in the Enlightenment also against racism and sexism, as can be observed in the work of Langue de Gauche in her Esclavage des Nègres, and from 1788. Women philosophers did not only suffer the constraints, they also, and they wouldn't have become philosophers. They distanced themselves from these constraints by reflecting the circumstances. Third part, the gendered universal, or a philosophy in its own right. The task of including women philosophers in the historical canon challenges us on two levels. One, as I have said, the paradox of the inclusion of the excluded. The other is the problem not merely of understanding how the excluded could create a body of ideas, but also of defending the view that this body of ideas was able somehow to change the course of philosophy. How can we conceive this gender-aware philosophy that generates claims of universal validity? In the following, I will present examples of 3 female philosophers who each shaped a philosophy of their own, which has become an accepted part of our tradition. Marie de Gournay, Émilie de Châtelet, and Elizabeth of Bohemia were thinkers who did not share a common methodical endeavor, but they shared a common reference to antiquity and to each other's thought. So we have a tradition. Marie de Gournay, author of The Equality of Men and Women from 1622, and editor and commentator on Montaigne, had a wide impact by grace of the royal backing she received, so that her writings were also read in England. The courage with which she presented her philosophical ideas made her a famous figure of her age and also later. She also compared herself to Diotima and Aspasia and judged the value of male philosophical writings from the perspective of the treatment of gender. When Gournay refers, for example, to Macrina's dialogue from the 4th century on the soul and resurrection, to contrast the bodily machine to the immortal soul, she is arguing in defense of the intellectual equality of the sexes in spite of their bodily difference. Her main target is the gendered personalization of God. Quote, "If anyone is so dull as to imagine masculinity or femininity in God, such a person shows in plain light that he is just as bad as philosopher as he is as theologian." Quote end. So Gournay criticized the tradition of philosophy. She criticized political patriarchy in connection with the different gender roles of religious persons. She created an eminent argument against the endeavors of the new political conservatives of her time who defends the Counter-Reformation, as this is presented, for example, by Jean Baudin. The recognition of the problematic status of the idea of a gendered male principle as basis for political legitimacy gained wider notice and was then carried further in the discussion of Locke against Filmer. Although Elizabeth of Bohemia enjoyed an excellent education, she was even nicknamed La Grecque. She knew about Gournay because her friend Anna von Schumann had corresponded with her. Her critique of her friend Descartes exemplifies how metaphysical topics were transformed when quite private, and in this case female, reflections by Elizabeth on her physical self-experience are taken account of. Based on this, she criticized Descartes' view on the separation of the soul and body, arguing instead in favor of the concept of a continuous matter. The third example, Émilie du Châtelet, was also concerned with the re-examination of the Bible and also with the rewriting of Newtonian physics, and also with outlining a new methodology for philosophy and science. Like Gournay, du Châtelet associates herself with Diotima and Aspasia. As a woman, she experienced considerable hostility, but also extraordinary success. Her Foundations of Physics was dismissed by her Berlin colleagues as a mere imitation. But then, in Germany, at least for a certain period, this book became part of the canon of selected writings, only to remit it once more to oblivion in the misogynist period of German idealism. Her works influenced the Enlightenment philosophers, were printed and reprinted within the Encyclopédie, and affected the methods of physics in the succeeding century. Like Diotima with Socrates, she reversed the roles of teacher and scholar. Kant dedicated his first publication to her, to a treatise on the vis viva, and was later even accused by Eberhard of copying from her. Du Châtelet identifies the conceptual contradictions as a method for evaluating scientific and social truth, and also for identifying social and gender injustice. She began her professional career, therefore, with a critique of John Locke and what she saw as his empiricist relativism, which allowed women to be made, quote, the servants of men. As a critique of male, gendered, nationalistic and philosophical dogmatism, she embraces observational experience against the scholastic fables and reveries concerning science and women. She identifies individual experience as giving a certain weight to particular data within the range of probabilities. In using probability functions as a tool of philosophic and scientific reasoning in this way, Du Châtelet is the first to oppose monocausalistic theories of knowledge. Therefore, she is the forerunner of Hume and Kant. Knowledge, she tells us, is constructed within certain degrees of probability which flow from a sequential weighting of the results of each step of reasoning. Her skeptical view towards claims of truth of dogma was at least motivated by her gendered experience. It makes her a fervent opponent of idolatry, obstinacy, and partisanship, quotations, in the history of philosophy. Thus, rewriting the history of philosophy. If we extracted from mainstream record only the ideas initiated by Gournay and Du Châtelet, the tradition would look very different. Today, we acknowledge that the personalization of God as a male is a self-contradictory dogma. This is part of our history. Today, we acknowledge Du Châtelet's view that individual experience, irrespective of national or gender attributes, is the basis of knowledge. Gournay and Du Châtelet are only two examples of the many female philosophers who created robust arguments and shaped the course of philosophical history. A similar impact has also been exerted by Sophie Germain, by Harriet Taylor, Victoria Welby, though these authors continue to be read from a perspective which sees them as falling outside the dominant interpretational patterns. Little by little, however, the research thus is being documented will change our view as we find ourselves confronted with a hitherto hidden genealogy of philosophical topics and arguments which have always belonged to our history. For a long time, women's ideas were ignored, partly because we relied on histories of philosophy which took no notice or misevaluated women's ideas, partly because we did not know that those ideas were invented by women philosophers, even as those ideas were appropriated into the canon. And there are many more examples. I wrote this in many writings, even Habermas and Hannah Arendt, this is Sartre and Beauvoir. This is a long story. Female philosophers have been active from antiquity on and were present as philosophers throughout the centuries. They acted, responded, criticized, and improved the course of philosophy. They were neither unique nor isolated cases. Their philosophical work withstood the oppression, and their influence has been greater than hitherto assumed and admitted. Female philosophers were inventors and developers of ideas. They initiated lines of arguments, of questioning, and of approach. Rewriting the history of philosophy is not only a task that corrects the past, it also gives rise to new philosophical tasks. As the explanation of our world that has been provided to such a large extent through male ideas, philosophy now has the opportunity to create a more complete concepting synthesis by connecting the existing ideas with the ideas women have synthesized over the ages. Rewriting the history of philosophy can thus change philosophy for the better. Philosophers have, in the course of philosophy of history, repeatedly shown that even when shunted into the clandestine, their ideas are powerful enough to prevail against the hollow power of established institutions. If this were not so, and if this were not possible, all of our philosophy would be good for nothing. This, many philosophers have successfully proved. Thank you.
So again, we have about 10 minutes for questions.
Thank you very much for this very interesting talk. You told us that there were institutions and spaces that enabled women a philosophical contribution, and you mentioned Bologna. Would you mind mentioning some others that were the most important ones in your view?
So there were several in Italy, also Pavia. And it's wonderful, as my cousin studied in Pavia, I discovered there that the tradition, Pavia is also a university in Italy that has arisen out from a jurisprudence tradition, not from a Catholic or cathedral school. And so we have, till the 17th century, and even the figures are in front of the university, from 17th, 18th century professors there. And there are professors even in the German tradition, in the alternative academic traditions. I think this is very important. So there have been academies founded in Tübingen. So the founder of the Tübingen University, his mother, first founded a Platonic academy. And yes, she collected women and women's thought. There are, even in Russia, there are various examples, yes, about that. There are big traditions. As I have studied in Naples, I know that till the 13th and 15th century, around Naples, the medical tradition was handed over by women. So it was only the counter-revolution then, very late. And this is something one has to have in mind, that the burning of the witches only started with the bull in 1494. That is at the time when the women came out and had their second coming out, let's say, like that. And thus only, it was not during the Middle Ages, it was in the Renaissance that the Pope gave out this bull against and explained these women and the strong traditions of women in rhetorics as Aspasia. Aspasia is said to have been the teacher in rhetorics to Socrates, and Socrates has this in his Menexenos, but the Menexenos is critically observed by feminists and mainstream philosophy the same. So she is ignored, or she is incredibly important. So the tradition of rhetorics and medicine is very close to women. And I think in various countries we can see that the tradition, as I know from Italy and the south of Italy, that the medical tradition has been very close to women. And so it doesn't take us wonder that schools that arose from these traditions have included women. But although the feminists can now say, but they didn't have they haven't been the directors of it and so on. It is, you always can give counter arguments, but you have to see that it was impossible to erase them completely. And you have to have the look exactly on these points to say, oh, where were the possibilities? It is not that when a dictator comes and says, you all are not allowed to speak. There are always some, like in Nazi Reich, you see these examples. There are some who contradict to the mainstream and do not, and they, at the end, they have the victory. This is the moral of the history. Okay, thank you.
More questions? I would have one. You mentioned that there is this accusation of misogynism towards the Neoplatonic tradition, and at the same time this tradition is mentioned as the one that was open to allowing women to a school tradition. Yeah. So how does it go together?
So, to understand what you want to tell me, or you pose your question a second time, you say that Neoplatonism of the Renaissance. You speak now of the Neoplatonism of the 4th century, or
including ancient Neoplatonism.
Yeah, against Hypatia, or which one?
I mean, there is this accusation. And at the same time, you
yes.
see that this tradition was much more open
yes.
towards
yes.
women than any other tradition.
Yes. So it's difficult to talk about that because it is obvious that first Plato, we know that his mother was a Pythagorean philosopher. We see that Plato introduced women on the most important parts of his theory. His theory of forms is introduced by Diotima. And this is important that she says to Socrates, you're wrong in every respect. You take the things, but you have to create the things. This is the moral of her essay. It is with Plato contradicts the Pericles democracy with the words of Aspasia saying, we are not all equal, or the best is, we have to be the best among the equals. And he says this is what Aspasia has said. And so the tradition, you can't bring it to an end that the Platonic tradition always is important. The women always refer to this tradition. Although, on the other hand, it is obvious that within the Platonic tradition, that we have nearly a whole continuity. And it's one of my dreams to have a conference, a big conference with Sarah Hutton on Platonism and feminism. Because this seems to me to be the stream under the history which is going. But there is the Aristotelism, and it is like in the 20th century, Aristotelism, it is interesting, and I think from the part of his theory, it has been important for Aristotle himself to contradict Plato, even within his gendered theory. This is essentially to Plato and to Aristotle. And in the Renaissance, they have understood that the Aristotelian cosmology, the I-centered cosmology, is deeply connected to his misogynism. So, but the fight between Platonism and here even an openness, let's say, and it is not so. So, as Émilie du Châtelet has said, there is no philosopher who is right in every respect. So this is even true for Plato. So there are many points we can criticize within Platonic and Neoplatonic tradition, but there are many open arguments too.
Okay, so there are no other questions. Let's have a break and the videos.
Yes, thank you very much.